Hey guys, and welcome to RPGMD, a resource dedicated to writing you a prescription for all things dice, dragons, and gaming. Today we're going to be covering a topic that's near and dear to my heart as I've spent far too much of my adult life studying it, that of diseases. Now, there are very few official resources for diseases in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and actually the only resource we have right now is going to be the Dungeon Master's Guide, and it's only on one page. So I thought we'd dive right in, cover a little bit of the basic diseases that are covered there before jumping into some more creative, kind of advanced diseases that have been written by the community in another video. And the only real resource we have on these subjects is found on page 256 of the Dungeon Master's Guide, which states that the specifics of how disease works aren't bound by a common set of rules. Diseases can affect any creature, and a given illness might or might not pass from one race or kind to another. A plague might affect only constructs and or undead, or sleep through a halfling neighborhood but leave other races untouched. What matters is the story you want to tell. I think in reading this part of the Dungeon Master's Guide, we can see that diseases, like most aspects of 5e, are entirely left up to the Dungeon Masters, the players, and their imagination. Disease could be an aspect of your campaign that's completely forgotten about, or it could be the main focal point of your story. It's entirely up to you. I think one of the greatest examples of disease in Dungeons & Dragons in 5th edition thus far comes from the driving force of one of the official campaigns, Tomb of Annihilation. And don't worry, there's not going to be any Tomb of Annihilation spoilers here. The campaign itself centers around the death curse, a wasting illness afflicting everyone who's ever been raised from the dead. Victims grow thinner and weaker each day, slowly but steadily sliding towards the death they once denied. Tomb of Annihilation provides a great example of how to make disease a focal point of a campaign, but I understand that most of you probably aren't looking to make every single session be about disease, or your players will probably hate you. So if you're just looking for something more along the lines of spicing up an existing campaign, there are 3 examples that the Dungeon Master Guide gives us of diseases that aren't quite as punishing as never coming back from the dead, but are definitely punishing in their own right. And let's go over those now. First up of these diseases is going to be Cackle Fever. Now, Cackle Fever is a disease that targets all humanoids. However, gnomes are strangely immune. And with this disease, your groups of humanoids are going to frequently succumb to fits of mad laughter, which is why this disease is called most commonly the shrieks. Now, as a dungeon master, you'll be given a little bit of leeway, as symptoms will manifest not immediately, but 1d4 hours after infection. And you can start giving little hints to your players about they're starting to feel a little feverish, they're starting to get a little disoriented, and then after these number of hours, they start to experience the disease as a whole. Now, the infected creature will gain 1 level of exhaustion, which is another mechanic that we'll talk about in a different video, and that exhaustion is not gone until this disease is completely cured, which it is not automatically done after a long rest. A unique aspect of Cackle Fever is that with this disease, any event that causes the player character or the affected creature to have great stress, which is entirely up to the DM but includes combat, taking damage, experiencing fear, having a nightmare even, forces that creature to make a DC 13 Constitution saving throw, and on a failed save, the creature takes 5 or 1d10 psychic damage, and that is additional damage if the stress was damage on top of that. In addition to the damage, that person is now incapacitated with mad laughter for 1 minute or 10 rounds. Think Tasha's hideous laughter kind of laughter. Now, you can get out of this laughter, as at the end of each of your turns, you do get to repeat that saving throw, and if you save that saving throw, you are no longer incapacitated. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, any humanoid creature that starts its turn within 10 feet of a creature with Cackle Fever who is madly laughing must succeed on a DC 10 Constitution saving throw, or they also become infected with the disease. And then once the creature succeeds on this saves, they no longer have to make them against that creature for 24 hours. Now, at the end of a long rest is when we finally get to start trying to stave off this disease, as an infected creature can make a DC 13 Constitution saving throw. If that save is successful, the DC for the save to avoid the mad laughter will drop by 1d6. However, they still have the disease after a long rest, unlike most other conditions. Now, you will slowly make these rolls at a long rest of 1d6 of lowering and lowering those Constitution saving throws, but the disease does not end until the saving throw of that DC is 0. So you could, at the earliest, be saved from this disease after 3 rolls, and at the latest at 13 rolls. And finally, as if all of that wasn't punishing enough, if any creature fails 3 of these saving throws, they gain a randomly determined form of indefinite madness, which is another aspect of the Dungeon Master's Guide that we don't have time for today, unfortunately, either. Now, as a doctor, I have to try to think of something in real life that kind of is similar to Cackle Fever, and fortunately for us in the real world, there isn't quite anything that severe. The closest thing I could probably think of is tertiary syphilis, which is when a syphilis infection gets so bad it spreads to your brain, which you may have heard about with someone like Van Gogh. And you certainly go mad, but luckily just being near someone with syphilis isn't enough to get it. It requires a little more contact than that. The next disease we're going to talk about is actually a group of diseases that all fall under the same name, and that is sewer plague. And sewer plague is kind of a generic term or broad category of diseases that you give to players when they pass through kind of gross, disgusting, disease-ridden areas like the sewer, garbage dumps, swamps, troll layers, kind of you name it. It's going to be anytime they're fighting disease-ridden creatures like rats, oozes, trolls, whatever. So when they get hit by these creatures, you can have your player character make a DC 11 Constitution saving throw, or they get infected. And unlike Crackle Lung, this takes place in 1d4 days, not hours, is when they start showing symptoms of this disease. So it can be something you bring up maybe in the next session. And when they do, they start to get a big number of symptoms: fatigue, cramps, things like that. And kind of mechanically, you get 1 level of exhaustion, kind of similar to the Cackle Lung, but also they only regain half their normal number of hit points from spending a hit dice, and they get no hit points after they take a long rest, which will be pretty punishing, especially for those kind of healer-deprived parties. Now, at the end of each long rest, you get to make a DC 11 Constitution saving throw, and if they fail that, they get another level of exhaustion, but a successful one will decrease the level by exhaustion by 1. And if they do succeed on that saving throw, they also recover from the disease, so this is a lot less punishing in terms of fully recovering than Cackle Lung. Now with sewer plague, it's a lot easier to make some real life examples because the list is so long in general. It could be anything from the common flu to a cold or anything else. Some real life examples that are more serious that would come into play, especially at these later levels of exhaustion that you can get from a bite, would be like tetanus, rabies, or even something like rare and bad as something called hantavirus. Now the last disease we're going to cover today is something called sight rot. And sight rot is an infection in the eyes that people actually get after drinking tainted water. And I know you're a better DM than I am if you're reminding their character that they ran out of water and need to go look for it, because I never remember this stuff. Now, if you do remind them and they drink tainted water, they must save on a DC 15 Constitution saving throw, or they get infected. One day, no roll involved here, after their infection, their vision will start to become blurry, and they will take a -1 penalty on attack rolls and ability checks that rely on seeing things and using their sight. At the end of each long rest, after their symptoms start to appear, the penalty worsens by 1, and then when it reaches -5, the victim is fully blinded until they get their sight restored by magic such as Lesser Restoration or Heal. Now, the Dungeon Master Guide actually does give a way to cure this disease other than long rest, which is a rare flower called eyebright, which grows in some swamps and will kind of be up to your Dungeon Master to decide when they get it. and if given within an hour, a character who has proficiency with an herbalism kit can make a dose of an ointment that will stop the disease from progressing. And if applied to the eyes before a long rest, one dose will prevent the disease from worsening, and after 3 doses, the eyesight is completely restored to that character. Now, unfortunately, sight rot is actually one that has a very close real-life example. There's actually a disease called river blindness, where parasitic larvae kind of crawl through your skin, travel up into your eyes, and lay more larvae in there, and they kind of eat your eyes, causing blindness. It's not contagious, and unfortunately there's no special flower to prevent it. It's a anti-parasitic. And that wraps up our first video on diseases in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. I want to hear about any crazy diseases that you've made for your characters in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like, favorite, subscribe. On our next video, I'll be covering the Malady Codex, which is actually an in-depth or more detailed look at diseases in Dungeons & Dragons that was made up by some player characters, for those of you who want to bring a little more pain to your player characters at home. I'm RPGMD, and I'll see you next week for your next prescription on all things dice, dragons, and RPGs.